A progressive state cannot be neutral. It cannot just let people live their lives as they see fit, because if people do that, they might not choose to be very progressive. Hello and welcome back to Niemietz Answers. In this episode, we're going to talk about liberalism. And the first question that comes up is liberalism a coherent ideology? Yes, it definitely is. The problem is just that in this country, we have the unfortunate habit that we sometimes use liberalism in the American sense, and we sometimes use it in the British or the European sense. In American English, liberal means left-wing or progressive, whereas in British English, liberal used to refer to classical liberalism. Now, classical liberalism is a philosophy of individual rights and individual freedom, where freedom means primarily freedom from interference by other people. So it's the right to be left alone, basically. Progressivism, on the other hand, is a philosophy of group rights. Progressives believe that society consists of oppressed groups and oppressor groups, and they see it as their job to fight for the oppressed. Now, both of these are perfectly coherent ideologies. They're just also very different ideologies. So you have to make it clear which of the two you're talking about. Liberalism and progressivism differ especially in the role that they assign to the state. For a classical liberal, the state is there to protect individual rights. And beyond that, not much else. A liberal state does not try to steer society in any particular direction or promote any particular set of values. But the whole point of progressivism, on the other hand, of progressive politics, is to promote progressive values and steer society in a more progressive direction. It's to promote values such as diversity, inclusivity, protecting perceived victim groups, and so on. So you can see why these two ideologies, liberalism in the American sense and liberalism in the European sense, why they are in conflict. A progressive state cannot be neutral. It cannot just let people live their lives as they see fit, because if people do that, they might not choose to be very progressive, right? They might decide that they don't particularly care about diversity, for example. So a progressive state has to be a lot more hands-on than a liberal state. And it has to get involved in many more areas. A liberal state is a state that is limited in size and scope, whereas a progressive state is large and hyperactive. Both are coherent ideologies, just don't mix them up. The next question is liberalism an ideology? Right, I prefer to call it a worldview or a political philosophy, because ideology sounds pejorative, sounds rigid and dogmatic. Of course, our opponents see us in that way, but the thing is, everyone sees their political opponents in that way. Nobody ever thinks of themselves as ideological. It's always the other guy who's the ideologue. Everyone thinks that they are just stating facts and evidence, and that their opponents are being ideological and biased and unreasonable. But it's kind of pointless to call your opponent an ideologue when your opponent thinks of you in the same way. What I would say though is that liberalism, classical liberalism that is a broad church, and that classical liberals are pretty good at handling disagreements both internally and in debating with non-liberals. Liberals do have a robust debate culture compared to other groups. Marxists, for example, are famous for falling out with each other over small theoretical differences and then forming splinter groups that fight each other and that accuse each other of being traitors. I couldn't think of a present-day equivalent of that on the liberal side. We don't really do that, although to be fair, there are historical examples that I could think of that go a bit in that direction. The next question is liberalism good? Well, I think we should judge political philosophies primarily by how they turn out in practice, by the results that they produce when they're implemented. There are, of course, no purely liberal societies anywhere in the world. because political philosophies are never implemented in pure form. Real liberalism has never been tried, you could say. But there are societies that have, to varying degrees, been influenced by liberal values. And the most liberal societies in the world also tend to be the richest societies in the world, the freest societies, and generally the sort of places where people want to live. They are net immigration societies rather than net emigration societies. Liberalism is rarely popular in the abstract, but most of the world's migration movements are from less liberal to more liberal places. So where people get a chance to vote with their feet, they choose more liberalism. The next question is liberalism still relevant today? Now, I can't speak for the whole world here, but in Britain, yes, it definitely is. Because if you think about it, what are the biggest problems facing Britain today? There's the cost of housing crisis, the cost of living crisis, there's stagnant productivity, stagnant wages, there's the healthcare system that's falling apart, there's crumbling infrastructure, there are the challenges of an aging population, threats to freedom of expression, cancel culture. Now these are all issues on which liberals, classical liberals, have a lot to say. You may not like their answers very much. You may think that we are totally wrong about all of that. But no matter how much you disagree with liberals, I think you couldn't possibly claim that liberals aren't at least seriously thinking about those issues, or that we're not placing them at the top of our agenda. And if that's what being relevant means, then yes, what philosophy could possibly be more relevant today than liberalism? Let's go on. Is liberalism capitalism? You could say that capitalism is an expression of liberalism when applied to the economic sphere. Liberals believe that a society should be mainly based on voluntary interactions and voluntary agreements, not on top-down command and control, and not on majority decisions either, but on individual decisions under the rule of law. Now, if you organize an economy along those lines, what does that look like? It would mean an economy based on freedom of contract and voluntary exchange. And that's a capitalist market economy. Liberalism is not the same as capitalism. It's just that capitalism is the only economic system that is compatible with liberalism. Next one. Is liberalism democracy? Liberalism and democracy usually go hand in hand. They almost always come as a package deal, but they are nonetheless not the same thing. Democracy is a form of government, but liberals are more concerned with the scope of government than with its precise form. They are more interested in what powers that government has, in how it can exercise those powers, and above all, how that power can be constrained. Liberals want to limit the power of the state, even if that state is a democratic one, because a democratic state can still be tyrannical. Majorities can be tyrannical. For a liberal, policies that curtail individual liberty do not suddenly become okay just because the majority approves of them. A liberal democracy must be more than just majority rule. It must also contain some limits on state power, which even the majority cannot override. Is liberalism the opposite of realism? That is a common criticism. Our opponents would see it that way, or some of our opponents. They would say that liberals are naive because they assume perfect rationality and perfect information. They believe that everyone is a calculating, utility-maximizing cyborg, when in reality, critics say, human nature is not like that. In reality, human judgments are often irrational, impulsive, ignorant, emotional. But I think that's a bit of a misunderstanding. Liberals don't believe that everyone is a perfectly rational and perfectly informed utility maximizer. That's just an introductory textbook economics model. What liberals don't believe is that irrationality and ignorance are best dealt with by giving the state more power over our lives. Because we don't suddenly become more rational or more knowledgeable when we make political decisions. To the extent that we are irrational and ignorant, we are also irrational and ignorant political actors. So look at politics today. You can't tell me that that is a rational process. That's not the opposite of realism, that's just being consistent. Is liberalism good for the country? I think I've already answered that. We just need to look at how liberalism turns out, not compared to some hypothetical ideal, not compared to, for example, an imaginary Marxist utopia, but compared to the next best real-world alternatives. And in that comparison, yes, liberalism quite clearly is good for the country, I'd say pretty much any country. And finally, is liberalism a political ideology? I've answered that one as well. You can call it that, but it is a broad church ideology which still leaves plenty of room for disagreement, for learning, and for self-correction. Thank you for listening.